2 years of preparation. 2 months of events. $15 million in expenses. Quebec New York 2001 was set to be the most spectacular and creative expression of French-Canadian art and technology the world had yet seen. Its organizers envisioned an ambitious statewide cultural festival that would redefine what Quebec meant to her neighbors and to the future. It would all culminate here, in the Winter Garden of the World Financial Center in Lower Manhattan, where on this day, workers are assembling exhibits in the shadow of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. It is Monday, September 10th.
Acceptez-vous que le Québec devienne souverain? Ce sera ça, la question. Et il y aura oui ou non.
Quebec New York 2001 may be considered the latest expression of the province's ongoing independence movement. The previous 2 decades each saw a referendum put to vote on whether Quebec should become a sovereign nation or remain a province of Canada. While both referendums had failed, the second in 1995 had come tantalizingly close, the margin barely 0.6% of all votes cast. Quebec may not have been a sovereign nation, but as a province, many of her people still held fast to their sovereign identity, and at the start of the new millennium, it was this which the organizers of Quebec New York 2001 looked to share with the world. As it happened, Quebec already had a presence in Manhattan. Their government office, the Délégation Générale du Québec, also known as Quebec House, was built in Rockefeller Plaza in 1940. To date, it remains the province's biggest office in the United States. It was here on November 30th, 2000, the building's 60th anniversary, that Quebec's Prime Minister Lucien Bouchard had first hinted at the Exposition. Chief among its organizers was Michel Letourneau, Commissioner General of the newly formed Bureau of Seasons of Quebec and head of the nonprofit organization Quebec International Events. On May 30th, 2001, Letourneau announced that $15 million had been earmarked for the Exposition, which would take place later that summer. Around 2/3 of this cost would come from government funds, while the remainder, around $4 million, would be paid by the private sector. Among these private investors were Daniel Langlois, founder of Soft Image, whose software was used to create the 3D computer animations increasingly common in Hollywood films. Also joining was Montreal's own Cirque du Soleil, already a household name for their spectacular acrobatic shows. At least one of Soleil's contortionists was employed by still another member of this trust, playwright Robert Lepage, who 2 years earlier was part of a similar exposition in France called Le Printemps du Québec à Paris, or Quebec's Spring in Paris. This 1999 exposition received mixed reviews. Too expensive, too big, and poorly organized, it did little to change the perception that Quebec was a land of wide-open spaces and log cabins. But that exposition didn't have private investors. This one did, and they planned for a very different outcome. As the name implies, Quebec New York 2001 was intended to take place in New York City. We're certain that New Yorkers will be delighted by the project's originality and spirit, said Letourneau, and that they will discover an innovative, open, and dynamic nation with a distinct culture and attachment to the French language. In so doing, the organizers look to raise Quebec's international profile as to its economy, culture, and technology. It aimed to facilitate international trade, raise cultural awareness, and increase tourism. Successful or not, the Bureau of Seasons was planning to hold such expositions every 2 to 3 years, starting with another in Latin America in 2005. Beyond the millions of dollars expended, there was a very real financial interest as well. In the year 2000, Quebec sent $12 billion in exports to the U.S., chief among them aluminum, electricity, telecommunications equipment, and newsprint. Increasingly, this trade focused on New York City specifically. In all, 15% of Quebec's exports went through the metropolis, more than they sent to both Europe and Asia combined. One of every 5 men's suits sold there was made in Quebec by the Montreal-based Peerless brand. Quebec also produced 1/3 of the city's metro rail cars, created the technology used on the Nasdaq's digital screen in Times Square, and also delivered high-end office furniture. The North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, had increased Quebec's total exports to the United States by another 10%, though as the dot-com bubble burst, there were growing concerns about an economic slowdown. But the exposition wasn't simply a matter of shipping a bunch of art to show at New York. Beyond a few private investors, more than 250 businessmen would also take part, along with 230 local artists, dancers, mimes, and musicians, all with an overarching focus on new technology. Quebec is on the cutting edge of technology in the arts, and that is the message, said Pierre Jacquer, the exposition's project manager. Among these exhibits was the Cloud Harp, a laser sensor that deciphered various patterns in the sky, translated them into computer code, then played them as music. There was also Beam Beat by lighting designer Alex Morgenthaler and computer programmer Marc Lavallee, which invited spectators to interact with rhythmic beams of light. Also in attendance would be Peter Grutter, professor of physics at McGill University, who would discuss the latest developments in nanotechnology. As a collection of primarily creative individuals, even the way in which this group traveled would be done with a special flair. In July, a flotilla of 5 40-foot sailing vessels would assemble in the port of Quebec City, carrying a combined 43 artists, musicians, and other performers. On August 1st, the flotilla would sail west down the St. Lawrence River to Montreal, then from Lake Champlain cross the border into upstate New York. Traveling down the Richelieu River to the Hudson, this friendly invasion, as it was called, would make several stops at riverfront communities. At each stop, the group would assemble Quebec Place, a small street fair where artists would perform and show their works. These shows would be free to the public, each building anticipation across the state for the big finale in New York City, Operation Quebec Downtown, as it was called. There, the flotilla would dock behind the Winter Garden to join the rest of the staff and open the exposition. Quebec on Hudson is a poetic way to build a friendship along the way, rather than just arrive by plane, said Roche Landry, the group's publicist. The New York Exposition would then begin on Thursday, September 13th, and continue through Sunday, October 7th. It would combine existing shows already scheduled with new ones specifically brought in for the event. One of the first, set for the 14th, was called Follow the Footsteps. On the 17th, there would be a fashion show featuring the designs of various Montreal labels, including Sean, Denom Vincent, Luc, Philippe Dubuc, and Hilary Radley. On the 20th would come the debut of Benoit Lachambre's solo work Undone Delirium, which, according to a brief article, quote, combines dance with a visual and aural environment. From the 22nd to 23rd was La Grosse Pomme Bleue, or The Big Blue Apple, which would feature readings from key authors of Quebec drama, including Serge Boucher, Michel Tremblay, Jean-Marc Dalpé, Waji Mouad, Daniel Denis, and Carole Frechette. The 25th would see the dancers of Compagnie Marie Chouinard bring the first of 2 premieres to the Joyce Theatre. Another venue would see O Vertigo perform their stage show Luna. 10 restaurants in the city would include Quebec cuisine specially prepared by Jean-Pierre Curtat, the head chef at the Casino de Hull and the Casino de Montreal. In all, up to 25 cultural performances would be staged at various locations, including the Lincoln Center. Even the Corning Gallery in the Finger Lakes region, many miles northwest of Manhattan, would host an exhibit called Contemporary Quebec Glass. But September 21st would mark one of the most anticipated events of the entire exposition, the American debut of Robert LePage's latest play, Zulu Time. Co-produced by Michel Bernatchez and Peter Gabriel with LePage's Ex Machina Theatre Company, plus a film by François Girard, this techno-cabaret had only previously been performed in Paris and Zurich. One portion of Zulu Time involved a story about airport security and international terrorism. A critic described it as a combination of, quote, airport ambiance, erotic fantasy, and jet crash angst. When writing this play, LePage had conducted research on Middle Eastern suicide bombers and terrorist training camps. We were faxing experts to ask if we had the right turban and if they would necessarily wear a beard, he said. The play's climax featured what was described as, quote, an apocalyptic plane crash. The five-boat flotilla for Quebec New York 2001 left as scheduled on Wednesday, August 1st. One of the boats carried a panoscope, which took 360-degree photos of their journey for a 10-minute video that would be played in a domed theater after they arrived in New York City. By the 10th, the group had stopped in Montreal and now ventured south across the border into the United States. Their first New York stop would come in Plattsburgh. Their second came on August 16th at Whitehall, where at 7 p.m. they docked at Skinnesboro Harbor Park. Knowing his town had many French descendants, Jim Aiken, Whitehall's deputy town supervisor, requested the group's musicians put on an impromptu concert. Accordion performer Steve Normandin obliged, and as the crowd recognized the song You Make Me Love You, they sang along in English. "We want to give people an idea of Quebec," said Alexis Dumas, one of the performers, "and that in Quebec we groove." On August 17th, the flotilla made their next stop at the Yacht Basin in Fort Edward, where their Quebec place would stand for the next 2 days. Marilyn Pulver, the town supervisor, didn't speak a word of French, but was nevertheless excited for the group's arrival. Taking center stage were performances by the Ship of Fools, a theater group, and a boy band called Q Club, which played an eclectic mix of reggae, gypsy, and Celtic and Cajun music. There were also games, storytelling, and samples of Quebec cuisine. Makeup artists did face paintings for kids. The boats then set out again at 5 p.m. on the 19th. On the 23rd, the flotilla was in Albany for another 2-day stay. There, in the state capital, Quebec politicians were preparing for an economic conference to settle the Champlain-Hudson Trade Corridor Coalition, a cross-border trade compact that had been in the works for over 2 years. Much like the Exposition, this agreement was unusual for also involving the private sector. The forum was set for the following month, from September 24th to the 25th, to coincide with the Exposition's final days in New York City. Troy, New York was next on August 26th, the festival taking place at Riverfront Park. "It's like a neighborhood relationship," said spokesman Remy Charest. "You don't really know much about the other side until you have a block party and really get to know each other." During the following leg to Kingston, Charest noted the toughest weather they'd had on the entire voyage was 4 raindrops. "We've been blessed with absolutely amazing weather," he said. On Friday the 31st, just in time for Labor Day weekend, the flotilla docked in the historic Rondout waterfront in Kingston, then set up their Quebec place at West Strand Park. Along with the same performances from their previous stops, the team's landscape gardeners created a unique garden to remain on the Kingston waterfront. All these accounts were from newspaper articles published during the flotilla's voyage, certainly a positive sign for Quebec's $15 million investment. "Quebec has begun its $15 million Quebec New York 2001 assault on the Big Apple," wrote journalist Pat Donnelly. "A flotilla of historic ships sent down from Quebec arrives in New York City on September 12th, setting off an explosion of Quebec events, including Robert LePage's high-tech Zulu time, intended to update the image of Quebec in New York. Will it stir up a counterattack from the Big Apple next year?" On Monday, September 10th, as the flotilla made their next stop in Peekskill, New York, work intensified on the biggest Quebec place in Manhattan, themed with the phrase growth and risk. Rather than travel in the flotilla, these workers had arrived much earlier by plane. In all, they totaled more than 200, including the Exposition's delegation, which were housed in the headquarters at the World Financial Center. The center's glass-enclosed winter garden now included a blue banner with the Quebec New York 2001 logo, the exclamation point featuring prominently in their advertising. The building was filled with displays, including the Montreal Brainwave, a presentation of 14 digital creations by Quebec artists. If the United States is known for its hardware and Europe is known for its software, then Montreal should be known for its brainware, said Monique Savoie, director of the Société des Arts Technologiques. Mannequins were also strategically placed through the Winter Garden and Courtyard Gallery, along with the nearby Embassy Suites on Albany Street, 2 blocks south of the South Tower, where many of the workers were staying. And most visibly, a large banner with the Exposition's web address, quebecnewyork.com, was just that Monday placed over the North Bridge, the pedestrian overpass that connected the World Financial Center to the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. The bridge also had at least some artwork on display inside, all of it roped off behind ribbons bearing the Exposition's logo. At night, the lights inside would illuminate transparent works set into the 3x3 square windows. From all accounts, none of the Quebec New York 2001 exhibits or events were set to take place in Austin J. Tobin Plaza, nor in the World Trade Center itself. The stage with seating at the base of the North Tower was that week intended for the Parsons Dance Company, which was scheduled to perform there at 7 p.m. on September 11th. This Quebec New York 2001 is a first gesture, read an article in Le Devoir. It will have to be followed by other actions of the same nature, so that it can one day be said that Quebec American adventure had a high point on September 13th, 2001. "We were ready," said Letourneau. "We were polishing the furniture." Just after midnight, Harold Ghislaine arrived in New York City with 6 of his co-workers, set to help finish preparations the following day. Exhausted from their flight, Ghislaine went to sleep in his hotel room at the Embassy Suites. The next morning, he didn't hear anything at 8:46 a.m., but at 9:03 came a sound loud enough to shake the windows in his bed. Peering outside, he grabbed his camera and ran out into the street, leaving behind his passport, papers, and wallet. Also joining the crowd was André Boulard, who was responsible for the Exposition's launch logistics. He, too, started to take photos. "Then, when the first tower fell, I understood that we no longer had any business there, that it was serious," he said. "American fighters crisscrossed the sky. There was a smell of the end of the world." Remy Charest, who days earlier reported on the flotilla's excellent weather, was in similar trouble. Back on land, he heard the first explosion as he brought his laundry to the hotel's front desk. In his rush outside, he left his cell phone and computer in his 15th floor room. After searching for a payphone, he returned to the hotel to find it had been evacuated. Michel Letourneau had just flown in that morning. It was in a cab on a bridge when the North Tower was hit. A radio station in Quebec called him, asking what was happening. Then the second plane hit. "Are you not speaking?" said the voice on the phone. "I don't know what to say," he answered. He then told the driver to take him to Quebec House. Many of the volunteers would muster there, including Remy Charest. At least 70 others found their way to the home of Delegate General Diane Willamy, 3 blocks north, near the Museum of Modern Art. At 9:59 a.m., the streets beneath the Quebec New York banner on the North Bridge were crowded with fire engines, ambulances, and hundreds of first responders. Seconds later, the South Tower collapsed, and the cloud of ash surged through the streets. Harold Ghislaine had met up with his co-workers, only to lose them again in the cloud. They reunited at the ferry station, where they crossed the Hudson. Joining them was Martine Primo, a publicist for the show, who was in the World Financial Center when the first plane hit. When the South Tower collapsed, she fell, and someone else fell on top of her, followed closely by the cloud. Somehow, she made it out of the building and onto the waterfront. Back at Quebec House, it wasn't until 3 p.m. that Michel Letourneau learned the fate of his staff of Quebec New York 2001. Miraculously, all were safe, including a lone technician for Cirque du Soleil. Such may not have been the case if the attack had occurred just one day later when the flotilla was scheduled to arrive, welcomed by New York Governor George Pataki, Quebec's newly elected Premier Bernard Landry, or the day after, when events were set to begin at the Winter Garden, drawing an expected 100,000 passers-by each day. But still, the tragedy did not leave the nation of Canada untouched. As of this writing, 24 Canadians were lost in the attacks, including former NHL player Garnet Ace Bailey, who was on United Flight 175. Quebec House arranged to bring the volunteers home as soon as possible. The first bus left that same Tuesday with 53 Quebecers. The rest were found lodging at other hotels before they too made the trip. 3 more buses left Wednesday with 90 people in total. By the 14th, the last of the delegation was back home, many utterly traumatized by what they had witnessed. None had to show their ID at the border, as in many cases they simply didn't have them. Staying behind were the 40 permanent employees and 10 temporary staff of Quebec House itself. But what about the flotilla? The 5 boats left Peekskill on the 10th, and during their travel day on the 11th couldn't be contacted by Letourneau from Quebec House. From what could be found in publicly available sources, the flotilla was presumed safe, simply because it wasn't scheduled to arrive until the 12th. It's unlikely they completed their journey. Manhattan, and particularly the financial district, was locked down. The flotilla was likely intercepted at the Hudson and sent back north. Whatever the case may be, it is all but certain that these sailors were the very last of the Quebec New York staff to learn of the atrocity. Premier Bernard Landry canceled his plans to travel to Manhattan. He called the 9/11 attacks a monstrous act and opened his province to the recovery effort. He offered to treat the injured in Quebec hospitals and shelter anyone whose flights were diverted there. While some optimistic performers hoped to perform at least some shows in New York later that month, that immediately became impossible. Debris from the collapsing North Tower had smashed through the glass dome of the Winter Garden, the exhibits inside written off as a total loss. Moments earlier, the North Bridge allowed a group of survivors to escape the collapse of the South Tower, led by Battalion Chief Joseph Pfeiffer. In this extraordinary footage by Jules Naudet, the same documentarian who captured the moment the North Tower was hit, you can see the group walk past the exposition's displays. Minutes later, when the North Tower fell, this bridge was destroyed. Still, in these photos from Ground Zero, you can see some of the banner raised the previous day. And in this photo, Quebec New York 2001 ribbons dangle from shattered windows. I returned 2 weeks later to assess the extent of the damage to our equipment, said Letourneau. When I arrived at Ground Zero, there was a smell between kerosene and burning flesh, if I can put it that way. It's a scent I will never forget. Robert LePage immediately canceled any showings of his play Zulu Time, acknowledging that its depiction of airline terrorism, quote, touches a subject that may be inappropriate. Unfortunately, the New York Times had already gone to press with a feature on his play for that Sunday's Arts and Leisure section. The rest of the exposition, including Le Cri du Monde and Etude No. 1 at the Joyce Center, was officially canceled on September 22nd. But on that same day, a benefit concert was scheduled to take place on September 28th at the Molson Center, now the Bell Center, in Montreal. It, too, would be called Quebec New York, but this time with the subtitle A Show for Life, as it raised funds for the Red Cross. More than 12,000 people arrived at the sold-out 5-hour show, nearly all of them waving U.S. and Quebec flags. Premier Landry and opposition leader Jean Charest were among the dignitaries on hand. Headlined by Celine Dion, the concert began with the shortened version, the very show that had been planned for the September 13th opening of the New York Exposition. When I was 10 years old, a 100-year-old eucalyptus tree stood on an empty lot downtown. The city wanted to cut it down and build a senior center, but one of our fellow residents objected. When the city council ignored him, he climbed into the tree and refused to come down. Bundled up in a sleeping bag and communicating with a walkie-talkie, Will the Tree Man Leroy became a local, then even an international celebrity. For more than a week, through a rainy California winter, Will drew a crowd. People hoisted food, water, and clothing to his perch. Petitions were signed. News vans parked around the block. My father took his case to court and was granted a temporary restraining order against the developers. The tree would live, at least for now. And on February 26, 1993, Will climbed back down, victorious. But already the crowd had scattered. At that moment, on the other side of the country, terrorists had set off a truck bomb in the parking garage beneath the World Trade Center. Quebec New York 2001 wasn't the only event canceled by the atrocities of September 11th, nor was its loss anywhere near the most significant, much less important, to be suffered that day. Indeed, it's been all but forgotten. But the exposition's swift and sudden end, much like the adventure of Will Leroy, wasn't simply the consequence of catastrophically bad timing. It also turned the exposition into something much more. It now lives as a symbol of countless destinies forever changed, a thing frozen in time, forever incomplete. Its last form standing is a time capsule of the 11th hour, the final microsecond before impact. Within it lives the essence of a world that seems so quaint, even frivolous to the world of today. The temptation is there to find a way inside, to try and live in that moment, shielded from what came after. But time only moves one way. I want to thank you all for watching this video, and I want to thank the 9/11 Memorial and Museum in New York for their help in answering my questions. For my regular viewers, I know this is a very different video from what I usually post, but it was inspired by the same curiosity. Sometimes wanting to learn more about something will steer you in unexpected directions. By posting this video, I also hope to learn more. If you or someone you know is involved in Quebec New York 2001, either the exposition itself or the flotilla, Please consider sharing your stories in the comments below. And if you weren't, tell me what you think about the exposition. How do you think it would have been received had the attacks not occurred? And if you're new to this channel, please consider checking out my NASCAR content, including 500 Days, which in a future episode will also document the sports response to the events of September 11th. In the meantime, thank you for watching.